Well, what I'd like to do is address those two virtues that have been mentioned, and I'd like to begin with pietas. Now, pietas is the Latin word from which we derive the English word piety. Now, when we think about piety, I don't think many of us think of something that's terribly or easy to associate with manliness. It's generally, I think, something that brings quiet time in the woods to mind. Maybe with your Bible, perhaps with Thomas à Kempis or some other devotional book, and it's a sense the sense that's communicated with. Or the idea is communicated with the word piety, is that you're withdrawing from the world in order to uh, focus upon spiritual matters and look upward, of course. And all of that's just fine. I think we all, I think as Christians, want to encourage strong prayer lives, uh, good study habits, meditation, and so forth. But pietas, classically understood, was much more capacious. It had to do not so much with a withdrawal from the world, so much as an engagement with the world. Pietas was something, particularly within Roman culture, but also more broadly within the Greek-speaking world, something that pervaded society, and it was essentially the uh, the practice of acknowledging your debts. So your debts, obviously, are not just simply monetary in nature. In fact, if you're thinking about what you know the Greeks and the Romans had in mind when they were thinking about this particular virtue, they were thinking more along the lines of what you owe to your benefactors. Now, as a child, your benefactors obviously are your parents, your mother and your father, but uh, the the circle or the concentric circles of benefaction go outward and ultimately upward. So with Greeks and Romans, there was a kind of religious dimension to this sense of indebtedness, and a pious man, a pious woman, were people who recognized that they were debtors to all the people who had contributed to making them who they were. And if we think about, say, for example, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, uh, early on in that book, in his Meditations, he spends a chapter, several pages, thanking all the people who made him who he was. Um, Now, how does that relate to the theme that we're talking about or addressing tonight in terms of fatherhood? Well, a father in the Roman world, one of his responsibilities was to acknowledge his own debts and the debts of his household to the gods, to the Roman state, and then also enforce, and this is significant, enforce a kind of gratitude uh, by everyone in his house to those benefactors as well. And of course, in the process, there would be the recognition of his own contribution to everyone in the house in terms of how he has made everyone in the household's life possible. So this is kind of the background. Now this was marvelously expressed in the Aeneid. In the Aeneid, what we have is Virgil's great work, the epic work that had been commissioned by the emperor during a time of political crisis in which people were being, what the emperor wanted to see was people encouraged to recognize their debts to one another and to take care and to through that recognition address their responsibilities and do what was right in terms of caring for one's elders, for one's children, and so forth. And And in order to help and motivate motivate people to do their part in terms of contributing to the social good through giving proper regard to all those people that they really ought to be grateful to. The Aeneid outlines just how this worked in the great hero Aeneas. Now, Aeneas was believed to be the ancient father of the Roman people. Now, you're probably familiar with Romulus and Remus and that story, but going further back, Romans believed that their ancestor was Aeneas, and Aeneas was a hero on the Trojan side in the Trojan War. You were introduced to him in Homer, but Virgil takes up the story, and Virgil takes up Aeneas' story as the city of Troy is collapsing. The Trojan horse, the Greek horse, has been brought in to the city, and of course, the Greeks get out of the horse in the night and begin to burn the city and open the gates so that other Greeks can come in. And so, anyways, it's a horrible scene. It's a bloodbath, and Trojan warriors are rushing to fight the Greeks wherever they can throughout the city, and it's a hopeless cause. And in the midst of this chaos, Venus, the goddess, who is, according to the story, the mother of Aeneas, she appears to him and tells him to stop fighting, to go to his home and rescue his family, his crippled father, Anchises, his wife Creusa, and his son Ilius. And so he goes home, and when he gets there, his father, Anchises, is uncooperative. He doesn't want to leave. He wants to go down with the boat. He wants to go down with the city. And so Aeneas is torn. He doesn't know what to do at this point. Creusa is pretty clear that she wants to leave. She wants him to save both her and their son Ilius. And at that moment, there's a sign that appears on the brow of Ilius's head, a blue crown of fire. And when Anchises sees this, he understands what this implies. This is a sign that this boy is going to be the father of a royal house. So at that point, there's another sign in the sky, and Anchises says, "All right, I'm ready to go." And so Aeneas says, "All right, father, get on my back." Now, just so you know why he says this, Anchises is crippled. He can't walk. And so he crawls up on his son's back, Aeneas, who is a pretty impressive fellow, very he's a hero. He's an ancient hero. Of course, he's impressive. But anyways, his father gets on his back. He takes his son by the hand, Ilius. He has a sword in the other hand, and his wife, Creusa, follows behind. Anyway, they get out of the city, and one thing follows another, and eventually they, through a series of marvelous adventures, Aeneas ends up in Italy. But the thing I want to stress is this image of Aeneas carrying his father on his back and leading his son by the hand. There you have 3 generations. And this image was often stamped on Roman coinage because what it expressed was the virtue of pietas. And often the very word would appear on coinage beneath the image of Aeneas carrying his father Anchises on his back. Now that is a manly image. It's what would be comparable in our culture to it would be comparable to say maybe a fireman carrying an older person out of a house or whatever. But that's the image. And so what it conveyed, as I've been stressing all along, is that a pious person, man or woman, fulfilled his responsibilities, did his duty by expressing gratitude and returning, making a return to all of those people who had made a contribution, to making him or her who they were. Now, within the household, within a household structure, the lines of obligation and debt are pretty clear. And within Roman society, pietas was something that was expected of every member of a household, and the head of head of a house was to express pietas for the house in the religious life of the city of a city, and also with regard to recognizing the place of the household within the civic life of his community. So as you can see, there wasn't this strong bifurcation like we've experienced today between religious matters, which often are considered to be personal and private and inward, and social matters, which are concerns for the law and for um, you know public and political discussion. Instead, what you had is a very integrated way of thinking about the whole, a very, I dare to say, Christian way of thinking about the whole. When we as Christians recognize Christ as Lord, as one who is seated at the right hand of the Father in heaven, when we think about the Apostle Paul's uh, uh, description of Christ seated in heavenly places, one of the things that made that such a powerful image for his audience in the first century was the fact that Romans thought of Caesar as someone who is seated in heavenly places. And when Christians confessed that Christ is Lord, they were in essence saying that our ultimate debt is owed to Christ, even more so than Caesar. Christ is the one who's truly the Son of God and is seated in heavenly places. And so, because of that, the Christian faith within the first century was very pietistic in the sense that Romans understood pietistic or pietism. It was pietas or pius that was operative within the Christian community, and it did it called for Christians to give due regard to civil authorities, but not worship them. The only one who was to be worshipped, of course, was the risen Lord Jesus. So that is an important background for understanding the role of a father in the ancient world in terms of leading his household and requiring of his household pietas. So leading his household in pietas and requiring of his household pietas. So there was no sort of, as I noted just a moment ago, no public-private distinction. It all was sort of woven together, held together by this sense of recognizing your debts to those who have been your benefactors, parents, civic leaders, and ultimately the gods or the one true God, the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, all of that I wanted to make sure I had in place before I address the second virtue that I'm going to talk about, and that is gravitas. Now, when you hear the word gravitas, you probably have an image come to mind of someone that needs to be taken seriously, and that's exactly what the word is intended to convey. That this person is a person of substance. A person who has gravitas has weight, and there you have it. The word gravitas obviously related to the word gravity. So to have gravitas is to have weight. It's to be heavy. And the reason why a father in the ancient world would strive to develop gravitas is because as the head of his house, as the person who is responsible for representing the city to his house and his house to the city, he needed to be taken seriously. Furthermore, within his household, he was called upon to execute justice. Now, the word, and I imagine John's going to get into this a little later, the word uh, economy uh, uh, comes from two Greek words, oikos nomos. Oikos nomos is literally house law. And when we think about the economy today, we don't necessarily think of households. In fact, that may be the last thing we think about. We might think of markets or banking or whatever. But in the ancient world, an economy was the way a household operated productively as people worked together just to survive and make a living. There were no corporations in those days. There were no large enterprises. There was no workplace that you went to every day to do productive things. No, your household was where it happened. And so consequently, because pietas was something that suffused public and private life, and because serious work had to be performed in households just to survive, a father, as head of house, needed to have weight so that he could make sure that things got done the way they should be done. So Gravitas was instrumental to executing justice and reinforcing the standards and the practices of a functional and productive household. Now, when we think about the word gravitas, it might seem like that would be something that might not be appropriate for the modern father. In fact, I think that one of the reasons why modern fathers are taken so lightly in public, conversations about fatherhood or popular entertainment and its depictions of fathers is because we no longer expect a father to perform a vital function in the larger world or even in his own household. Basically, our households have degenerated into just basically recreation centers where people go home at the end of the day and crash. But if we want to see fathers performing their role in the household in a way that reflects biblical standards and Christian standards, then I don't think that we can neglect gravitas the way we have. So how do you develop gravitas? One of the things to think about when we think about gravitas is that it does have a kind of antithesis, which is levity, which is lightness. Now, levity is a fine thing, and it can be a virtue as well. I mean, it's always helpful when someone has a sense of humor and can maybe lighten the mood in a room if there is some tension. Nevertheless, there are times when, as an authority, you need to be taken seriously. I remember, let me just tell you a quick story about a man who really had gravitas. And I remember him from my days in high school in Western Pennsylvania. His name was Shu. I don't know what his first name was. We just knew him as Mr. Shu. He was the vice principal of discipline at my high school. We actually had a vice principal of just discipline at my high school. And I remember I was sitting in a bus one day getting ready to leave the school with a bunch of other kids to go home. And there were some kids in the back of the bus who were tormenting some of the other kids on the bus. You know how it goes. Anyway, as this really awful and sort of almost dehumanizing situation was playing itself out in the back of the bus, Mr. Shu came out of the school's doors, and when he appeared, the guys in the back of the bus, said to each other, "Cool it, it's Mr. Shu." And Mr. Shu, he was a good sized guy, maybe 6'2", but he wasn't huge, and he was middle aged, and he was wearing a suit, like authority figures did back in the day. And he came to the bus. And when he got to the bus, he just looked up at the bus and he recognized the boys in the back of the bus. And apparently he was looking for them. He went to the door of the bus and he stepped up on the first step of the bus. This didn't actually happen, but it almost seemed like it did. It almost was as though the bus just tipped because he had such weight. When he got to the top of the steps, the entire bus was just silent. And he looked and saw the boys. And these are, boys, I'm calling them boys, but they're really young men. They're 16, 17, 18 years old. And he just looked at them, didn't say a word, and just pointed and did this. Then he turned around, went down the steps, and walked back to the building. And those boys, those young men, got up, heads hung low, and slunk down the aisle of that school bus and down the steps and out the door. And all the other kids felt great. They were happy, and that the weight had been taken from their shoulders because Mr. Shu had put some weight to work on those boys. Anyway, that's an example of how an authority figure who's taken seriously can serve the interests of justice and the community and even the weak. Maybe not just even the weak, but especially those who cannot fend for themselves, like those kids on the bus. Anyway, that's the kind of thing that any authority figure really ought to have characterize his demeanor if he's going to execute justice in a household, in a business, wherever. He needs to be taken seriously. He needs to have weight, and that's what that is intended to convey. Gravitas is weight. Now, how do you cultivate gravitas? How can you be taken? How can it go from maybe being a person who's not taken seriously to being a person who is taken seriously? Let me just give you a few tips. I think the first thing is you got to take yourself seriously and your role seriously. If you're not comfortable with that, if you're not the sort of person who can shoulder the burden of authority and leadership, then you're never going to have gravitas. If you're the sort of person that always wants to lighten the mood and make people laugh, you're never going to have gravitas. Now, as I noted before, being funny is fine. There's a time and a place for everything. But when it comes to exercising authority, when it comes to being sort of making the kind of impression that you want to make, when you have to exercise authority, then you need to develop gravitas, and you need to take yourself seriously before anyone else is going to take you seriously. Another thing is that you need to have self-mastery. You need to be the kind of person who's got full control over himself. If you have control over yourself, then you have not only the right, but the ability to exercise control in a social situation. If you don't, if that cannot be said with regard to you, if you're the sort of person that flies off the handle, maybe throws temper tantrums, or maybe it gets kind of scary and tyrannical, you might have people who are afraid of you, but at a deep level, morally, they're not going to take you seriously. They're going to look for ways to make light of you, take what you say lightly. So you need to have a kind of moral regard for the truth, and not just simply what you want in a particular situation. And I think it's an important distinction. When we're talking about exercising authority, we're not talking about just exercising your will. If that's the case, then you're just a hair's breadth from being a tyrant and a person who just pushes people around and bullies them. What you want is regard for the good, the true, the right. And if you have regard for those things, then that'll come through. And just one last thing, because I see that I'm out of time. Now, and the last thing is that you need to make sure that boy, I'm just drawing a blank now, Dr. Fahey. I just lost my train of thought. Yeah, if it comes to me later, I'll come back to it. But anyway, I'm done.
That sounds great, Chris. Hopefully we will have time towards the end to field some questions. We are running behind, so we'll try to communicate to the speakers to see if they are available to keep going. But that was great. And if you enjoyed that talk, that really is kind of a teaser for some of the things that you can find in both of Chris's books. So again, those are well worth finding and reading. I think everyone would enjoy them. Okay, next up,